further ado, I'm going to introduce Professor Amy Woodson-Bolton, who's going to introduce tonight's speaker.
I didn't introduce you.
Oh,
this is
you introduced
myself.
Okay.
We're good. Okay. So thank you so much for coming. These are so exciting when we get to spend time talking about our other passion, which is not just teaching many of you fine people, but also the research that informs so much of our teaching. So I thought, so my field is in modern European history, and I teach Britain and Ireland and world history and Western Civ. But I thought it'd be interesting, maybe just as a brief introduction, to talk about why Nick's work is so exciting from the point of view of a fellow historian, but who's not in the field of modern U.S. history. So kind of why is it that this is interesting and exciting from somebody who's coming to it from outside the field? So a little bit about Nick first. So he did his bachelor's and his master's degrees at the University of Oregon, and he completed his PhD at UCLA in 2005. This is something that all you students can aspire to. He had articles published in the Western Historical Quarterly and the Pacific Historical Quarterly as a graduate student, and both of those articles won Best Graduate Student Article prizes, which is quite a coup, really 2 for 2 there on that one. And he's published numerous encyclopedia entries and more book reviews than I can even count. It's quite extraordinary. The thing that Nick's work does is that that I find really exciting is that he tries to reposition and reimagine not just Native Americans in terms of how we think about them in urban history, but actually how we approach indigenous history, how we tell these stories. And actually, the way he's doing this fits into a number of broader trends in historical scholarship. And so I just wanted to outline kind of how I see him doing that, which I find quite exciting. So the first is that he's really moving us beyond simple binaries of kind of primitive savage versus the noble savage, which is how so many times you see Europeans approaching indigenous peoples. He's also profoundly historicist. That is, he's really trying to approach Native peoples in their own words and from within their own categories and trying to understand their own categories of experience rather than impose them from outside. His work does some really interesting and exciting things, and I think this is almost maybe even more true with the new project, which hopefully we'll hear a little bit about also, is that he combines cultural and social history. So one of the things that I see him doing is that he's considering representation, that is in fields of cultural history, art and film and literature, as important but not determinative, and he considers the role of Native Americans themselves in participating in cultural construction. So rather than seeing Americans as kind of the simple or the dupes of Hollywood, he actually sees them actively participating in that process and making choices about their representations within social constraints, and that's why it's such an interesting combination of social and cultural history for me. He complicates and really starts to play with these ideas of modernity, modernism, and modernization. And this is, again, especially in his new project, dealing with the Native American contributions to modernity, to the American modern, he considers the question of how Native people are not, in fact, the opposite of modern, but that modern comes about with indigenous people's participation. And that's very much, and again, and actually, I also study urban history, and so one of the things that he's doing is he's helping us reimagine cities as a place where modernity happens, where modernity gets articulated and enacted. And if we start thinking about that in those ways, he sees Native peoples as really participating in cities in a very exciting way. In terms of urban history, I really see him, again, complicating a simple binary of city-country, which is how people have for so long thought about the city. And he reconsiders this as a relationship of city-countryside, of city reservation, again, not as a binary, but as a continual relationship and exchange, and of migration and internal immigration, not as a single move, but as a process, and a kind of continual process where people are continually choosing where to be and how to navigate and negotiate their new lives. And in all of this, I think, again, what's so exciting is he sees Native Americans as real subjects of history, not as objects of history. So, with that, without further ado, Nicolas Rosenthal.
Thank you. Thank you, Amy. That was a wonderful and very generous happy and excited to be here tonight to talk about my book. The book has been a long journey. It took a very long time. It took me 13 years to write this book. That's 13 years from the point that I started thinking about it and pulling some of the ideas together in graduate school to the moment that I actually held the book in my hand. So for one thing to take out of this, any students who might be thinking about becoming historians or other scholars, one thing to take out of this is that you better really love your project, because you're going to be living with it for a very long time. You better love your project, and you better think it's really important. And I've been very lucky to find that. But I also had a lot of help along the way. When I look out in the audience, I see people who I interviewed and talked to about the project. I see many friends and colleagues who provided support along the way. I see current and former students who I talked to about the project, who had to endure me working the project into my lectures time and time again. And I see a lot of new faces, too. Been a lot of places in the last year talking about this book, and it's really good to be doing so back home, back here. So I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. I also want to thank the library for hosting this event. I want to thank Jamie for organizing it in particular. I also want to thank Jamie for letting me, in the spirit of pub night, select some of the beers that are being offered. I was going to talk a little bit about that, about my choices, but I should probably get to the book. So whatever you happen to be drinking, I want to say thank you for coming, and in the spirit of pub night, cheers. Water. So again, the title of my book is Reimagining Indian Country, Native American Migration and Identity in 20th Century Los Angeles. And I'll start by giving a brief overview of the project. I'll talk generally about the history of American Indians in cities, and a bit about how I got interested in the project, and explain why I've chosen to highlight Los Angeles as an especially good example of Indian urbanization. Then, after that overview, I'll focus on one of my chapters so that I can go into more depth about some of the ways that I'm telling and analyzing the history of cities. Specifically, I'm going to talk about the Red Power movement, also known as the American Indian Activist Movement, which occurred during the 1970s. It was taken up by urban American Indian communities. So I began this project in 1999, and one of the reasons I got so interested in studying American Indians, and that I stuck with it for so long, was that it became clear to me that the topic, that is American Indians in cities, was essential for understanding the last 100 years of the 20th century saw the steady movement of American Indians to cities, beginning in its early decades. As the United States urbanized during this period, Indians, like many other groups, recognized the economic opportunities that were available in cities. Migration of Native people to cities accelerated during and after World War II, when Native people joined the military and found work in defense plants. Then they built upon those experiences. The federal government also began promoting Indian urbanization in the 1950s through a program called relocation, which paid for thousands of Native people to move to cities and attend vocational schools. In subsequent decades, Native people continued to urbanize for a whole variety of reasons. Just to provide some sense of the numbers we're dealing with, we can look at U.S. Census statistics. Now, generally, the U.S. Census drastically undercounts American Indians, but census numbers can still be useful as a way to chart change over time. Okay. You can see here that in 1950, census takers found only about 16% of the Indian population in urban areas, and that's a relatively small number. It was likely higher, but still a relatively small percentage of the total American Indian population. Over the next 40 years, however, you can see these numbers substantially increase. By 1980, most American Indians, the majority of American Indian people, lived in cities. And probably this was true earlier, at least as early as 1970. These migrations were occurring all over the country, but they were greatest to very large metropolitan areas, cities like New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles. Also, cities close to large rural Indian populations have always had an Indian presence. Places like Minneapolis, Seattle, Oklahoma City, Denver. and these numbers are too low, but this gives you some sense of cities that have historically maintained significant Indian populations. Just look at these numbers, it seems pretty clear that cities have been important places for Native people. After all, most American Indians now live in cities, and this is a result of a long historical pattern of Native people migrating to and interacting with urban areas. What struck me as odd when I began this project was that historians and other scholars hadn't really made this case. I found a mention here and there of American Indian urbanization and references to the relocation program. It was a book about relocation simply as government policy, and there was some work by urban anthropologists that was done mostly in the 1970s. Native American historians, however, that is, historians of Native America, and U.S. historians had not thought carefully about American Indians in cities. There weren't any books on American Indian life in a particular city, and there weren't any historical studies about the role that cities had played in modern American Indian experience. The more I thought about this, the more I began to think that this was a problem on a number of levels. First, and most basically, it meant that our understanding of 20th century American Indian life or American Indian history was woefully incomplete because such a major aspect of American Indian life was not included, it was not understood. Second, however, I began to think that this lack of work on American Indians in cities contributed to certain stereotypes about Native people. Many people today don't think of American Indians in cities, frankly, because they don't think of American Indians as modern peoples. Instead, they think of them on reservations, far apart and isolated from modern. Or they cling to ideas about Indians as having vanished, along with the buffalo in the 19th century. Studying American Indians in cities seemed to be a way to explore how American Indian people had become very much part of modern American life. Finally, I realized that this omission in scholarship has implications for public policy. American Indians are a people with a long, troubling, and ongoing relationship with the federal government. Mildly. But over the past 40 years or so, there have been improvements in federal Indian policy. But how can federal Indian policy really serve Indian people, I wonder, if there's so little understanding about American Indians in cities, which represents a majority of the population? So these are some of the concerns that motivated my project. I focus on Los Angeles because historically, it has had the largest American Indian population in the country. It also has been the most diverse, with Native people from dozens of different nations and communities. By the 1970s, Los Angeles was known as the urban Indian capital of the United States, and it was second only to the Navajo Reservation as the largest population of American country. As I studied Los Angeles, however, I saw similar patterns in other cities. So I argue that Los Angeles is a model that can help us understand the history of American cities throughout the United States. Throughout each chapter of the book, while focusing on Los Angeles, I bring in examples from other cities to point tonight. Overall, my biggest argument is that historians, scholars more generally, and policymakers need to reimagine Indian country to include. By Indian country, I use a term that is often used to refer to places where Indian people live, that is, where a lot of Indian people live. Historically, it's been used to talk about places like South Dakota, where there are a lot of Indian reservations, or Oklahoma, where there are a number of Indian communities. I'm arguing that cities ought to be included as part of Indian country. Cities should come to mind just as quickly as South Dakota or Oklahoma, and that our scholarship and our public policy ought to reflect the importance of cities for modern American Indian experience. This book is meant to be a step in that direction, towards reimagining Indian country, by telling a history of American Indians in cities, focusing on Los Angeles. I cover a variety of topics. My first chapter is on Native peoples who migrated to cities to escape the intense poverty on Indian reservations in the 1920s. My next chapter looks at American Indian entertainers who traveled to perform in cities with a focus on Hollywood and the community of American Indian actors in 1920s and 1930s Los Angeles. So for example, I spent a lot of time talking about people like Richard Thunderbird he was Southern Cheyenne, and he was born in the late 1860s. His his parents' generation was the last generation to fight, to go to war with the U.S. military. He grew up, and he became part of the first generation to go to federal Indian boarding schools. In fact, he was part of the first class at Carlisle, which was the first federal Indian boarding school. So Thunderbird went to Carlisle. He graduated. He went back to his people in Oklahoma. He stayed for a few years. He had some kind of good jobs, jobs that maybe he could get at that point. But then he left, and he went to Los Angeles. Around 1900, he moved to Los Angeles, and he lived there for the rest of his life. For another 46 years, he lived in Los Angeles, and he became an entertainer. He led a troupe of Cheyenne dancers. He worked movies as an actor and a technical advisor. He gave public lectures at places like the Southwest Museum, right? He built this entertainment career, and he became part of a community of Native peoples living in Los Angeles who worked in Hollywood and various other. Here's Thunderbird in tribal regalia, right, which he ordered from Oklahoma and was shipped to Los Angeles for him. And this is a publicity photo. This is the Santa Monica Mountains where he's taking this. Here's another photo of him with his wife strolling along the beach as many. Another chapter looks at the relocation program of the 1950s through the 1970s, when about 155,000 American Indians accepted government funds to move from reservations to cities. We're leaving the Intermountain Boarding School in Utah in 1956 for jobs. Another chapter of the book looks closely at how American Indians settled into cities in the decades after World War II, with particular emphasis on patterns of employment, housing, and racial discrimination. Boy Jr., he's working at an aerospace manufacturing company, as many Native people in Los Angeles, especially in the post-war period. Another picture of the three generations of the Tafoya family. Probably my favorite picture from the book. Three generations of the Tafoya family at Clifton's Cabin. Grandparents come to town. Where do you go? You go to Clifton's, and it's 1956. Even if you live in Hermosa Beach, that's the difference. The next chapter examines urban American Indian organizations, from the first small, struggling groups in the 1920s to the social service organizations operating on multi-million-dollar budgets in the 1970s, such as the Los Angeles Indian Center. Finally, my last chapter is the one I'm going to talk about more today, which is about social and political activism in cities. That's a general overview of the book. I'm going to move on now to the next part of my talk, where I'm going to focus on this one chapter. I've titled it Grassroots Indian Activism, the Red Power Movement in Urban. I'm going to begin this with a small. On Thanksgiving Day in 1977, about 40 American Indian women and men ate their holiday meal at a drug and alcohol abuse treatment center in Los Angeles, near the downtown Skid Row district. It was run by a group called the United American Indian Involvement, Incorporated, or UAI. UAI was founded in 1974 with the assistance of the National Institute for Alcoholism and Alcohol Abuse to provide hot meals, showers, beds, referrals, and emergency medical care to Native people who walked in off the street. The staff was made up entirely of American Indians because UAI director and co-founder Baba Cooper believed that, quote, Indian alcoholics don't relate well to non-Indians. Among the celebrants on this particular Thanksgiving was John Eagleshield. Eagleshield was a 28-year-old Lakota Indian and the staff paramedic. He had recently received a degree from the Los Angeles Associated Technical College with the help of a federal grant administered through the Los Angeles Indian Center. This was his first Thanksgiving at UAI. He had spent the last few holidays participating in public protests organized by a group called the American Indian Movement. This year, in 1977, Eagleshield decided that the work that he could do for UAI would be, in his own words, quote, more realistic and meaningful. My argument that in order to understand Eagle Shield's experiences, we have to look at the broader changes in both federal Indian policy and American Indian activism that occurred in the 1970s. A bit earlier, during the 1950s and 1960s, the civil rights movement drew attention to the needs of ethnic minorities in the United States. It also helped to lead to new federal programs to address poverty and inequality. By the 1970s, American Indians, through their activism, began to tap into these programs. For the first time, local, state, and especially federal funds became available for local, urban, Indian-run organizations. They used the funds to serve the social, recreational, and cultural needs of urban Indians. This type of activism continues to begin with, then. Some of the first stirrings of major change for American Indians came in the late 1960s. One thing that happened in this period was that there was support for increasing the number of ethnic minorities enrolled in higher education. American Indians became part of this trend, and it helped set the stage for a broader Indian activist movement. For example, at campuses like San Francisco State, UC Berkeley, and UCLA, there were new American Indian Studies programs established, along with new recruitment and retention programs for American Indian students. At UCLA specifically, the American Indian student population rose from 7 to 70 in 1969, the first year of programs. In addition, 5 instructors of Native descent were hired to teach courses such as Liberation of the American Indian, American Indian Community Development and Interaction, American Indian Studies and Literature, and Survey in Native American History, first Native American History course taught at UCLA. Both this official recognition of Indians in cities, that is, the funding and the other attention from government agencies and universities, and the work of Native people who were empowered by these programs, together these two factors set the stage for the emergence of something that has been called the Red Power movement. The first event that would turn out to be the beginning of the Red Power movement was the occupation of Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay. On November 20th, 1969, 89 American Indians landed on the island, and they claimed it for a group they called the Indians of All Tribes. Most of these 89 occupiers were students from the new Indian Studies programs at San Francisco State, UC Berkeley. In fact, the Bay Area students traveled down to UCLA, and they recruited UCLA students right out of the classroom. This group of students combined with a group of older Native people who had lived in Oakland for some time. Together, they went out to Alcatraz. And they had only planned on staying at Alcatraz for a day. The idea was to get a little publicity, to invite the media, get a little publicity for Indian concerns, and then they figured they'd eventually get kicked off, right? Quickly. However, what happened is they got so much support so quickly they decided to stay a little bit longer. Over the next few months, the occupation of Alcatraz became a platform for airing Indian grievances, as well as a symbol of a renewed pride in Indian identity. The occupiers cited a history of abuse, of stolen lands, of broken promises. They claimed the island as Indian property, and they argued or they proclaimed that they planned to develop it into a center for the teaching of Indian history, culture, and spirituality. Extensive media coverage publicized this occupation, and that brought support from around the world. The messages of pride in Indian ancestry and examples of Indian militancy resonated with Indian people, and thousands journeyed to the Bay Area from around the country to join the protests. In all, the occupation lasted 18 months. Remember, it was only supposed to be a few hours, and it lasted 18 months, although it was really the first few months when it got the most. Here are just a few images here's a more recent picture of Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay. You can see the buildings that are on there are buildings from the Notorious Federal Prison that was decommissioned by the time that occurred. And in fact, one of the reasons the occupiers chose Alcatraz is that there was a conversation in the Bay Area, a debate in the Bay Area about what are we going to do with Alcatraz now that it's no talk of making it an amusement park. One of the things the occupiers did is they changed all the signage. This used to say United States property. Now it says United Indian property, Indians welcome, Indian land, and that's a Thunderbird, which became a symbol of the Red Power movement. Here's an image just showing you the difficult work of occupying. So following Alcatraz, following the occupation, other groups gained national attention with similarly confrontational methods, such as the American Indian Movement, or AIM, which staged a series of protests for the next several years. Most famously, AIM protested at Wounded Knee in 1973. Wounded Knee is a hamlet on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, and it has tremendous symbolic significance because it was the site of the 1890 massacre of Indian men, women, and children by the U.S. Army. It highlights the genius of the Red Power movement, that is, the Alcatraz occupation and the string of activities by AIM through the early 1970s. The idea was to generate national publicity to call attention to Indian concern. Kinds of choices of sites are really important. It generated national publicity at a time when the general public was poised to be very sympathetic to India. As the Red Power movement unfolded throughout the 1970s, right, as these large, high-profile protests were going on and generating national news and getting attention, cities also became sites of struggle. This has been the focus of my research. Before I got involved in this project, there had been some work on the big events of the Red Power movement. There had been work on Alcatraz and AIM. What I've told you here doesn't actually come from my own so far. What I wanted to know, well, I had a lot of questions, right? I wanted to know, how did the Red Power movement work on the local level in individual cities, right? The relationship between these national movements and how local communities understand and integrate them. What did the Red Power movement mean for local urban Indian communities? How did the Red Power movement influence the work of activists who were already working with Indian communities? Those are the questions I started with, and I found a variety of answers, a couple of which I'm going to. First, I found that urban Indians staged their own protests that were inspired by the Red Power movement. They were tailored to address very local concerns. These protests didn't always get the same amount of attention as the Alcatraz occupation and AIM activities, but they nonetheless drew upon the Red Power movement for tactics and ideology. So, for example, in December 1970, about 100 Native people protested at the Southwest Museum of the American Indian here in Los Angeles to demand the removal of American Indian remains and sacred relics that were on display. Similarly, a group called the Native American Committee organized a protest at the 1970 National Conference of Social Welfare in Chicago, where the Bureau of Indian Affairs, a federal agency, was to report on its work among Indian people. The group was joined by AIM leaders from Milwaukee and Cleveland who disrupted the conference by rearranging exhibits and commandeering the podium during a plenary session. Another group set up an encampment called the Chicago Indian Village outside Wrigley Field later that year to protest the housing conditions of Indian. There were additional protests in the early 1970s by urban Indians that included the occupation of Fort Lawton in Seattle, the Twin Cities Naval Air Station in Minneapolis, Camp Adair in Corvallis, Oregon, and a vacant Coast Guard lifeboat station in Milwaukee. Here's an image of Lawton in Seattle during the protests in 1970, and if you can see in the background, somebody does have a sign that says Red Power, about the middle of the picture. But also there's a woman standing there with a sign that says, we need a cultural center. Right? We need a that's a big demand of many Native people during this period, is that they've moved to cities and they're looking for somewhere to get together with other Native people. Right? Somewhere in the city where they can get together for social reasons, but also to kind of nurture culture in the city, whether that culture is tribally based or based more on a kind of urban Indian backgrounds. Right? And so I think this is what I mean when I say that the Red Power movement in cities was a local adaptation of the national movement. They used the tactics of the Red Power movement, but they're very local concerns. Right? This is the concern of Indian people in Seattle. They moved to Seattle. They want a cultural center. Tactics in order to get that message out there and get support. And in fact, they did get a cultural center. There's a beautiful cultural center at Discovery Park in Seattle. So all of these protests in cities I see as local adaptations of the national Red Power movement. American Indians in cities were inspired by the protests at Alcatraz and by AIM, which got national attention. They adopted this method of public protest to try to draw attention to the concerns affecting their local urban communities. However, while some urban American Indians adopted the methods of the Red Power movement, others remained skeptical. Some urban Indians even looked upon the occupations and high-profile protests with quite a bit of disdain. During Alcatraz in 1970, a 49-year-old Indian from Oklahoma who worked as a janitor in Los Angeles stated in response to an interviewer's questions, "Well, I don't think much about Alcatraz or what they're doing. Younger kids, I think the younger kids, it's just what they see other people doing and they follow in their footsteps. They say, well, if they can do that, why can't I? They copy the Chicano and black militants." And that word militant is really important. Derogatory way during the time by people who don't really agree with Red Power or have some issues with the movement to other Native people involved in the movement. Similarly, a Comanche Indian from Oklahoma living in Los Angeles noted that she was, quote, more involved with my family and my community more or less in my area, and I just don't know. I really just don't have time to stop and look at what purpose the Indian protesters fought. Her husband then followed up by saying, well, my way of thinking is that these are really not our ways, the Indian way. Personally, I don't think they're all real Indians protesting Alcatraz. Other urban American Indians were more ambivalent about the Red Power protests. They were troubled by the protests, but they still formed an appreciation for the attention that the Red Power movement brought to Indian problems. A Tohono O'odham Indian living in Phoenix stated simply, I agree with AIM, but I don't agree with how they're approaching Indian problems. A 23-year-old Pawnee Indian in Los Angeles noted in 1971 that he personally did not associate with militant Indians, his words, but thought, quote, Alcatraz was a good thing. I didn't like some of the ways they were doing it, but I think it had to be done that way. It got a lot of attention and it shocked a lot of people because it told them, we're tired of being pushed around, and we're tired of being made fun of, and we're here. So you can see there's this kind of tension, right? There's this tension among Indian people during this period about the proper ways to address Indian issues. Some people embraced the Red Power movement. They embraced it to the point that they were willing to go out in these protests and apply it to their local community concerns. Others rejected it altogether, while still others had really mixed feelings. Nonetheless, I would argue that there was a point of agreement. Indian people had suffered injustice, and contemporary issues affecting Indian people. And despite some misgivings about the methods of Red Power protest, the Red Power movement, I would argue, or do argue, profoundly affected all people working within urban American Indian communities in two important ways. First, because of the attention to urban Indian concerns raised by the Red Power protests, monies for urban Indian groups dramatically increased to support a wide range of new organizations, social services, and education programs. Second, the Indian people running these local Indian organizations reflected many of the ideals of the Red Power movement, whether or not they believed in large-scale protest. In particular, these organizations reflected a belief in the importance of Indian culture and identity and the need to put it at the center of any effort to solve the challenges facing it. They also believed in applying pressure to government and institutional officials to continue and increase the support for their work, even if this pressure did not go as far as protest. By taking a closer look at some of the urban American Indian organizations that emerged during this period, I think we can see these things. Again, I'm arguing that the Red Power movement led to more support for urban Indian organizations. I'm also arguing that it influenced people within these organizations. It led them to emphasize Indian identity and culture and to be more forceful in demanding resources, whether or not they thought of themselves as quote-unquote militant Indians. One area in which there was an expansion of both federal support and American Indian social activism was in organizations for American Indians in cities that dealt with the issue of alcohol, like UAI, which is These organizations were influenced by the Red Power movement in that they were fueled by new sources of funding, and they sought to cultivate Indian identity as a way of helping clients. Programs to address alcoholism in American Indian communities and to train American Indians as alcohol rehabilitation counselors. And both of those are really important. Right? Opened in many cities during the 1970s, including Albuquerque, Baltimore, Dallas, Denver, Detroit, Los Angeles, Portland, Sacramento, Salem, Oregon, San Francisco, Seattle, and Sioux City, Iowa. So you just get turns all of a sudden, right? The fact that so many programs in just this one area were opening in so many cities. Evidence. Right? Programs did not exist before. To give you an example, the Native American Rehabilitation Association, or NARA, formed in Portland, Oregon in 1970. And it began with a halfway house specifically for Indian people. Steve Basquinet, a Menominee Indian, began the group after obtaining funds from St. Vincent de Paul and the Catholic Archdiocese of Portland. Basquinet hired an all-Indian staff because he believed that, quote, only another Indian can deal with an Indian alcoholic. And that's very similar to the quote in UAI in Los Angeles. Staff worked to help its clients by building a program of recovery that combined Indian culture and contemporary treatment methods. NARA took its clients to powwows where they established a sobriety tent, and it encouraged the sharing of Indian culture between members of the group. NARA also used more mainstream methods of treatment, such as the standard 12-step program and group counseling popularized by us. Some staff members felt that even more attention to Native culture was warranted, and they splintered off to work with organizations that placed additional emphasis on the development of Indian identity as a path to sobriety. A Lakota man named Devere Papasan Eastman began a group in 1974 that he named ANPO, which is a Lakota word translated as ANPO leased 20 acres in Mount Hood National Forest, where it established a camp that could house about 30 people for ceremonies. A similar group named Sweat House Lodge began in the late 1970s in Corvallis and was staffed by members of Portland's Indian community. The group took on live-in clients and treated them with sweats, drumming, singing, dancing. Well, the lines between these groups, between NARA, ANPO, and Sweat House Lodge, were never fixed. Together, they constituted a community that took Indian identity as a starting point and essential ingredient to NARA brought its clients to Sweat House Lodge and ANPO for regular visits. Clients switched programs or were placed according to their specific needs, and staff members moved back and forth between the groups. One Umatilla Indian man explained to me how after 15 years of living on the streets of Portland, he first sought treatment in NARA in the late 1970s, and then he eventually enrolled in Sweat House Lodge. He found that for him, nurturing his Native identity and working with other Native people replaced a need for alcohol. Sober, he went to college, he obtained a degree in art, and he returned to Portland to become a traditional. So with these treatment programs, the massive influx of federal funds helped establish new organizations for American Indians in cities across the country in the 1970s. These programs were unique in that they are run by Indian people themselves, and they sought to draw upon American Indian culture identity as an essential element in serving their clients. It had never been done before, not on this scale. Again, this was a result of the Red Power movement. It placed so much emphasis on the importance of Indian culture and identity, and which raised Indian issues to such an extent that funding agencies responded. One more example I want to discuss is higher education. The initiative to develop American Indian Studies programs and recruit Native students that began in the late 1960s, that intensified on the campuses of college and universities during the early 70s. Again, because of the new attention to American Indian concerns and funding. UCLA and its population of Indian students remained especially active. By spring 1972, 9 additional American Indian Studies courses were submitted for approval. Enrollments of American Indian students continued to climb through recruitment and retention programs. In 1973, an Indian counselor was hired to advise students on academic, housing, and personal issues. Certain graduate programs work to increase their Indian enrollments, such as the Masters of Public Administration program, which received a grant from the Federal Office of Economic Opportunity, and the Masters of Library Science program, with funding from the Federal Health, Education, and Welfare Department. By fall 1973, American Indian enrollment at UCLA was up to 195 students, including 32 graduate students. So that's 1973, 195 students. Remember that in 1969 it was 7. There's 7. You can really see the difference these programs are making. Many of these students participated in an especially vibrant American Indian Student Association, provided peer counseling, sponsored Indian speakers and musicians, and organized an Indian Culture Week every May. And that's the origins of POWA, which is still held. The director of the American Indian Cultural Center, which was the precursor to today's Studies Department. In 1971, this director noted that Indian students had always had to, quote, stop being Indian essentially in order to succeed in college. That changed dramatically under the higher education program. This ability to be Indian, socially, culturally, intellectually, while attending college, helped thousands of American Indian students graduate from Los Angeles during the 1970s, and these trends continue to the present. None of this, I argue, would have been achieved without the Red Power movement. One of the most important legacies of the Red Power movement was that it led to more support for programs that encouraged university attendance by Native students and curriculums designed to meet their particular. Federal funds dramatically increased in the 1970s to support these programs, as well as other organizations designed to serve a variety of other urban American Indian needs, like healthcare, job training, cultural revitalization, advocacy. The activists who made up these organizations reflected many of the ideals of the Red Power movement. They believed that previous efforts to address Indian issues had woefully neglected Indian culture and identity, and that only by foregrounding Indian identity could Indian problems be solved. They were not necessarily protesting in the street, like some Red Power activists were. They may even have criticized Red Power protests for not being the Indian way. But these activists were still keeping the pressure on officials and policymakers to continue work, something they learned from the Red Power movement. These local adaptations of the Red Power movement continued long after the high-profile demonstrations faded from the daily news. These adaptations marked the movement's transition from national protest to grassroots Indian activism. This is the type of activism that continues to this day as urban American Indian organizations continue to work to secure funds and serve the specific needs of communities. So, for example, UAI's website. UAI, again, is the group I'm part of the talk with. And you can see that they're still around today and very vibrant. They've really diversified their program. They've had to rethink their funding strategies, as all urban American Indian organizations did. You know, the good times in the 1970s didn't last very long. They lasted until about 1980, right, when someone else became president. And they were defunded drastically. But a lot of these organizations, many went out of business, many continued and kind of have had to do a lot of the same work in different ways, and UAI is one that really serves it, as well as throughout California. I could also talk about UCLA today, right, and have one of the most vibrant American student associations in the country. I could just dozens of other urban American Indian organizations in the country that trace their origins back to this period. So before I finish, I'm almost finished, but before I do, I'd like to mention one more reason that I got involved in this project and make one more argument for why it is important to recognize. I said that I thought the lack of work by historians on American Indians in cities was part of a larger problem of American culture and society, whereby American Indians are not understood as part Instead, American Indians are often thought of as remnants of the past, confined to reservations. This belief, I think, has also been assumed by many American historians. Generally, historians who study the 20th century United States, they don't spend too much time thinking about American Indians. I think this is because they regard American Indians as separate from the major trend culture. You can see this reflected in textbooks on 20th century United States. Rarely mention American Indians. And to a large degree, I blame historians of Native America for these omissions. Only recently, I believe, have a handful of historians working in American Indian history made strong connections between the field of American Indian history and other vibrant fields and conversations within the historical profession. The history of American Indians in cities shows that American Indians have been very much part of modern American life. In fact, in the book, I argue in each chapter that we can learn about 20th century American history, U.S. history, by studying the experiences of Indians. For instance, up until now, the Red Power movement has mostly been understood as a high-profile public protest movement that got a lot of attention in the 1970s. I've shown that after the high-profile protests died down, the reverberations of the Red Power movement could be seen in the grassroots activists who were influenced by its message and took the opportunity that the publicity created to get more funds to expand their community work. I wonder if this is a dynamic that can be applied to other protest movements. Media and even academics, we pay a lot of attention to public protest. We're captivated by images of people in the street calling for change, and the types of reactions that gets from people in authority. But these protest movements are often relatively short-lived. What happens after they are over? I don't think things ever go back to the way they were before, but rather that there are major changes that ripple through American society, changes that are perhaps more subtle and harder to see, changes that don't often interest the media because they aren't as flashy, but changes that scholars might be interested in understanding, should be interested in understanding. This was true of the Red Power movement. It went from high-profile protest in the streets to grassroots activism within urban American Indian communities. When I was first writing this chapter, it was during the 2006 immigrant rights protests. 500,000 people in the streets of Los Angeles in 2006, right? By far, the biggest protest that Los Angeles had ever seen. This made me wonder and got me thinking about what the larger long-term impact of these public protests would be on immigrant communities in the United States. American Indian history can help us think about these issues. It shows us a type of grassroots activism that should be considered part of the Red Power movement, as much as the highly publicized protests and demonstrations of the era. It can help us gain a better understanding of how movements for social justice are reinterpreted and transform over time, including perhaps more recent social protests such as Occupy LA. To get to these insights, however, we have to reimagine Indian country. I hope that my book, and perhaps even my talk today, will be a step in that direction. And thank you very much for coming. If there are questions or comments, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
You said that one of the big demands in a lot of the protests was cultural centers, or were cultural centers. Were new cultural centers built after the protest?
Yes. Seattle would be, directly related to that slide. That did lead to funding for a cultural center in what became Discovery Park in Seattle. A number of cities actually had cultural centers already. Los Angeles had the oldest, I call it cultural center, it was established in the 1930s. But even in cities like Los Angeles that already had some of these venues for Indian people to get together, like the Los Angeles Indian Center, there was a lot more funding that came in even to support those. Or like the Los Angeles Indian Center, they kind of run on a shoestring budget from when it was established in the 1930s through the 1960s. I mean, they were having bake sales and rummage sales in order to pay the rent from month to month, or getting funding from various church organizations. By the 70s, they start getting these big grants from the federal and state government, and even sometimes the city, and to do all kinds of things, to run social services, but also to run cultural and recreational programs. Yeah, it is one of the things that comes out. Funding for these cultural centers.
I'm here's the introduction, Ross.
Nick, you said towards the beginning when you were sort of sketching out your project that one of the things that you're looking at is the similarities between the American Indian experience in Los Angeles and in other cities. And I'm wondering if I could flip the question and ask you about the sort of particularities and uniqueness of the LA experience, given the particularities of Los Angeles, which is a very different city than, say, Minneapolis. Right? And so how that sort of helped to shape the experiences of what was happening here in Los Angeles.
I think one thing that's different about every city, including Los Angeles, there is going to be some kind of regional character in the sense of backgrounds who come to the city. So Los Angeles has always had, from the early 20th century, first of all, populations of native Californians, that is, California, who especially in those first decades of the early 20th century, join in the kind of labor patterns that build up the city. They work in agricultural areas throughout the city. They work in construction. They move into the There are also folks from throughout the Southwest, especially Navajo folks from the Southwest, as well as Oklahoma folks who come to Los Angeles in particular. During the Dust Bowl migrations in the 1930s, for example, a lot of native peoples from because it's a big kind of both Los Angeles and other cities, I think, have that kind of regional character. Chicago, you've got a lot of people from the Great Lakes, going to. One of the things I think that's really unique about Los Angeles is Hollywood and the entertainment industry. That was one of the reasons I wanted to write about Los Angeles, and because there's just that there is this big community of native people who are coming in. Big demand for them, especially Westerns are such a staple.
Very about Westerns.
Yeah. Very early on, I teach some Westerns. Very early on, you have this community, and that community, I think, becomes a nucleus for the organization of a larger American Indian community in Los Angeles. They're the people who start they're different. There are variations on the story, but some people will argue that they are the folks who really start. Salaries to help other folks who are coming.
You mentioned that there's the seventh or chapter in your book where you include actors in
Yes.
their. I'm wondering whether you have somewhere in the book you treat, or you have some notion focus for Indian kind of a marker for it. I'm thinking of things like the American Indian Dance Theater. Wonderful expressions.
Yeah, that's a great comment. I almost think somebody planted you in the audience because that kind of is my new project. Not exactly, but I am getting more interested, not so much in this book. I mean, Hollywood and the entertainment industry is a chapter where I developed some of those ideas. But my new work, I'm more interested in American Indian artists, and especially the first generation, or what I'm calling the first generation of 1920s through the 1960s. Went to federal boarding schools during a time when ideas about Indian art were changing, and they were starting to get some of the first arts education the Native people were able to get in these federal boarding schools. And then during the New Deal of the 1930s, they worked on a lot of public arts projects and fought their way through the art world to become prominent artists in the 50s and 60s. And I mean, exactly those kinds of connections about, the directions I'm going is thinking about their art and their expressions and using art. Talk about these complex identities, right? Changes of the 20th century and engage some of the big processes of the 20th century. How is that reflected in their art, and how does that art, articulate those kind of complex identities?
As people migrated into the cities, did you or perhaps with Native American people?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the big trends of the 20th century, not just in cities, but maybe especially in cities, right? Is that peoples, like all peoples, are interacting with all kinds of people in the city. It's such a complex, diverse milieu, right? And I think that's one of the reasons that a place like an Indian Center was so important, right? For people to come together with those very complicated family histories and identities and be able to articulate how that makes sense to them as Indian, right? This is what it's becoming, right?
I'm listening to you talk about migration. What I don't hear is terminology that reflects the causal factors for migration, such as the U.S. government's violation of 367 signed and ratified treaties. This were the hundreds of treaties that were signed and never ratified. The conditions within an Indian country that were that forced indigenous elsewhere to work in the 30s or work for railroad companies. And then the other thing what I don't hear is talk about a forced federalism narrative. So indigenous peoples from our respective First Nations were citizens of our own nations, but the U.S. recognizes some indigenous nations level, some at a federal and state level, some at state level, and then a lot of us, at least over 4, by the state or federal. Talk about that narrative of migration. Hear the forced federalism narrative, and I'm wondering the other question as I'm not Tonga, which is who's but as a settler colonialist and as a historian, what is your responsibility in your work in indigenous people?
First question. I mean, I do deal a great deal in my work with what I call power relations, or what I think you're talking about, which is the ongoing processes of colonization and colonialism. Right. In fact, I would argue that that's one of the major tensions in my work, is this tension between power relations, right? People in power, people subjugated, subject to that power, and how people respond to that. Resist or work within the structures, try to widen the structures, right? So, and I think that's true even in chapter on the Red Power. But other chapters, right? There's my chapter on the relocation program. A lot of my work is on the limits and the biases that were Indian people off of Indian reservations to assimilate them into American society. It goes back to the late 19th century, that big assimilation project, right? It's also about taking Indian lands, right? Getting the federal government getting out of the Indian business, right? Once and for all. That is by moving people away from their tribal land base. It's based on the assumption that once Indian people are going to move to cities, they're just going to blend into American society. And then, once Indian people are in cities, right, they're subject to a kind of continuing federal paternalism, right? The relocation program, they were placed in certain housing, they were trained for only certain types of jobs, there were home visits, they were threatened, funds would be revoked if they went back home. I mean, there's all this going on, right? And that's a big part of my work, is to sketch that out, right? To sketch out those power relations and to see as an ongoing process of colonialism. Another part of my work, though, is really trying to look from a Native perspective, to look for Native voices and try to understand how Native people understood these larger structures and how they in them or against them or everything in between. Spent a lot of time, too, in that chapter, for example, looking at how people work to subvert the intentions of the relocation program. From using the funds and doing whatever they wanted them to, and then going back home and then applying for the program again and doing it again and doing something completely different, to trying to change the program and eventually taking over the program. I mean, that's eventually what happened by the 1970s, is that the Native people themselves were running the programs that helped to settle Native people into the city, so that they weren't programs of assimilation. There were programs that ended up reaffirming Indian identity and just saying, this is part of Indian life too, right? Life in the city is. And it's nothing wrong with a program that's going to give you money to do this, as long as it doesn't cut off Indian identity. So I try to strike that balance, right? And I think of it as a tension, right? There's always this tension. And I think it's a larger tension within the field. Beginning in the 1970s into the 1980s, there was a lot of work on the power relations, right? On this is what's been done to Indian people, right? Over time. Talking before, you mentioned Donald Fixico's book on relocation. I think that's where that generation of Native Americans started. They're writing that narrative. Then I think there was a shift back to the other direction, right? Where it's like, okay, we need to see Native people not as victims, but we need to look for Native voices and see what they were doing. There was not as much attention to those power relations, right? I think where Native American history is today, I think the best work is somewhere in the middle, right? It's trying to understand both the structures of power, but also how people deal with and operate within those structures, and even overturn and change those structures. Very important question, and I had some things to say about it.
I asked as a settler colonial, assuming you're not Tonga, and as a historian, what is your responsibility?
Yeah, I mean, it's hugely important, and I think that's one of the things that is able to happen more and more, especially in California, especially among tribes who have recently fascinating things I've seen on television in the last few years is argue their vision of history, often in support of their current ventures, right? But I think there has been, in more recent years, right, ability by Native peoples to take control of the representation. My chapter on Hollywood in the 1920s and 1930s, I argue that in the end, despite everything they tried to do, they really didn't have much control over those representations. Directors, the film producers, the studio heads, and they decided how Native people did it, and you either go along with it or you don't work in Hollywood. I think things are, somewhat different today. Not totally, not completely, but there's more room for Native people to take control of those representations through art, through literature, through podiums like this, right? Through all kinds of other ways. Power that tribal gaming has brought to a small handful of tribes, right? My own work, and I think this might be what you're really asking me, is how Native person, right? I try to serve that by listening to Native peoples, by looking for their voices, highlighting those voices, highlighting their experiences, and talk to Native people about my work and mission. Trying to be very open-minded about that and take. Okay. Thank you very much for coming.